Good evening. Good evening. Thank you. Thank you. Oh, a phone. Good evening. And welcome to the resumption of Acton 250's countdown to the momentous events of April 19th, 1775. It will be my great pleasure in a few moments to welcome back Acton's own public historian, Mary Fuhrer, to focus us on the tumultuous summer and fall of 1774 here in our local area. But first, let's take stock of the resources we have assembled and plans for the coming months. Did you see the tables in the back as you came in, right over here? Remember that the Acton 250 events website displays descriptions of and links to previous and future talks, book discussions, open houses, and tours. It reads vertically with a link to Acton 250 merchandise and the most recent events at the top, scrolling down to a link to the first lecture last year. Perhaps the greatest satisfaction to the committee and each of the speakers to date has been the consistent and focused presence of such a large contingent of students from AB. Some committee members remember the impact of experience that he is motivated by the progression of awareness in the historical understanding to which we now have access. Each time we gather, last year, I used the well-known quote that the 18th century is a country we need to visit. Let's now revisit about 1773 and 1774 in order to fully appreciate how these events would have been experienced here in Acton. Updating the history, so many of us over here were taught decades ago about the role of taxation, we shifted focus in 73 to the power and prestige of the British Empire, fearful that the East India Company faced bankruptcy. Hence, what seemed reasonable in London, a tea tax, struck those in Massachusetts as a threat to traditional rights, especially as the fees would pay for the salary of judges. We heard of the central role of newspapers, and last year's sophomores immediately recognized that editors usually just reset the type for articles from other newspapers, seemingly plagiarism to the modern eye. Noted historian Mary Beth Norton refers to 1774, where we are right now, as the long year. She is referring to the destruction of the tea in Boston Harbor on December 16th, 73, and the tense period as Massachusetts awaited the response of the empire. It will be no surprise that the locals were amassing weapons, gunpowder, and drilling more often over the summer, while still viewing themselves as British subjects, loyal to the crown. We celebrated this lull this summer with Still Here, Houses of Our Patriots, and open houses at the Jones Tavern and the Faulkner House, and additional Acton tours led by Amy Cole. If you have not already checked out publicity on the tables behind us for upcoming events, please do so before leaving. For those primarily on this side of the hall, there will be on October 1st at the library, in the library will be closed, a Books and Brew celebration. Please consider coming from 5 to 8, correct? Plus 21. You have to be 20, well, that's why I was being subtle. I think they got it. These are clever kids here. You guys got it, right? Okay. We are exceedingly fortunate to have Robert Gross speak next month on the 25th about his pioneering study of the Minutemen. Our countdown to April 19th, 1775 continues now as Boston awaits an imperial response to the events of last December. Especially for the students this evening, I want you to think about the effect of a long, long, long lag time between a transgression and learning of its consequences. How about almost half a year? It'll take that much time for the news to arrive. And when it arrives, it is worse than anyone would have imagined. The Port of Boston is quickly closed, the provincial charter is abrogated, town meetings are severely restricted, and capital crimes will be heard in London, not here. As we welcome back Mary Fuhrer, let's remember how effectively she characterized the social context of the colonial experience for us. Its patriarchal organization necessitating that everybody fit in somewhere, which now confronts a sudden perceived threat to its viability. A Q&A session will follow after her talk. May I hear a warm welcome for Mary Fuhrer.
Of the last, my tech support of the last 44 years, so. Okay. Nope, it's not responding to my computer. Can you help me advance? Oh, you want me to use the pad?
It seems, I think
Now
we're
it's
okay
working?
now.
Okay.
Yep.
This will be an adventure for all of us. For over 6 decades, Acton has been celebrating Crown Resistance Day. So what is it? If you go to the web to find out, you'll learn that this is the day when Acton, this is a quote from the web, Acton drew up a list of grievances to send to the king, leading the Minutemen to enlist and go to war. Wow. That's pretty amazing, except that it's completely false. Let's see if I can get you to go forward. Here we go. In 1967, a mock newspaper, supposedly from 1774, reported, and there's this on the bottom, and this second column over, this is a blow-up of that, reported, on October 3rd, we cast our lot against the crown. Life and death, freedom or slavery is before us now. We owe allegiance to no crown. Now, this sounds like a veritable Acton Declaration of Independence, which is pretty exciting, if only it were true. So what are the actual origins for treating October 3rd as Crown Resistance Day? It comes from a 1954 book by Acton historian Harold Phelan, and he wrote about the results of a special town meeting. So you can see what actually, he says the date of October 3rd, 1774, which was a special town meeting, should be well marked. It defines the time when Acton cast its lot against the crown. What does that mean? What actually happened at that special town meeting? If you go there, you'll find out, if you go to your town meeting, which you can find online, by the way, your town meeting minutes from back to the beginning of town, which makes pretty interesting reading for nerdy historians like me. If you'll go and check those meeting notes, you'll find that they elected some representatives and delegates and committee members, and then they adjourned, and that's it. Nothing more. It's sort of disappointing. You were expecting maybe some midnight rides or stolen gunpowder or even a cannon or two hidden somewhere. Nothing like that. And yet these simple actions actually were highly significant, as Phelan well knew. was an excellent historian. To understand why, though, we have to delve deeply into Acton's particular story at the time, and this is what I hope we'll be able to do over the next 45 minutes. Then I want you to decide, was this the moment of decision, the moment that Acton decided to break with Britain? But before we do that, let's begin by defining a few terms. We say Crown Resistance Day, so let's start with Crown. The colonists had often resisted Parliament's actions and the laws that had been sent to them. And that's the legal right of British subjects, to resist, to protest. But to resist the Crown was outright treason. The Crown was a symbol of authority. So for Phelan to claim that this was Crown Resistance Day is a pretty heady claim. And resistance, the Crown is slowly disappearing. And up comes, it's connecting. What you're going to see next when it finishes connecting. Would you come and sit next to me and be my support?
If someone's really good at Apple, I guess,
Why don't you come be my support minister?
I think it's timing itself out.
I can change the timeout.
But while they're figuring out, there you go, yay! It's okay, why don't you just come and sit here, keep it from timing out. While they're figuring that out, I'm going to go ahead, knowing that you're all smart enough to get this without a picture. To claim that they're resisting the Crown was a pretty intensive claim. But what do we mean by resistance? Resistance also could be a political protest, and that's legitimate. But that's not what Phelan was talking about. He was talking about revolution, even to the point of violent revolution. And the last thing I want us to think about before we dive into this in depth is the idea of the moment. This is, hey, the whole world now knows. The idea that this was the day, the moment, when everything changed. And here I want us to think about whether things change in history that way, whether there is a moment. We like to think that we can name the time when things changed, and occasionally we can. It's a very popular idea. Some of you have probably read Malcolm Gladwell's The Tipping Point, this whole idea that everything leads to a certain moment, and a certain moment it all changes, which might be true. There are certainly certain moments when things change dramatically, like 9/11 or Pearl Harbor. But for the most part, and here I am sad that you don't see this picture because it took me forever to find a 6-legged stool, but there was a stool with 6 legs. For the most part, many historians believe that change in history happens as the result of movements that build slowly over time, with organizations forming, developing plans and ideas and proceeding to execute them, and essentially knocking one leg at a time off of that stool until eventually the stool falls. But is that moment when the stool falls the important moment, or is it the series of all the knocking out of all the legs? In other words, is this a movement that has happened over time? And I hope at the end of this presentation, you'll understand why I'll claim that both things are important. That recognizing Crown Resistance Day is very important for Acton's history, but also recognizing that Crown Resistance Day happened after a long series of actions and activities and decisions. Oh, thank you. Oh, there's our stool, our wonderful six-legged stool. Okay, so then we'll consider the moment or the movement. But let's dive in right now to get at what happened in Acton at this time. John Adams is a great witness for these things, and he had this wonderful quote that essentially says, the revolution had been accomplished before a single shot had been fired. Those of you who are students and have been studying this, I think you just finished the 1763 and the conclusion of peace from the French and Indian War. At that point, the people of Massachusetts were incredibly proud to be British citizens. And by 1775, they did not any longer think of themselves as British citizens or subjects. They thought of themselves as Americans, and that thought of the British as their enemies. This is a huge transformation in mentality, and John Adams notes it happened in those 10 years. So what happened in those 10 years? A whole series of changes that surprised, challenged, and eventually transformed the American colonists, and particularly the people in Massachusetts. But when it happened in the towns. We focus so much on Boston. John Adams said it happened in the countryside, and he means the country towns. Yes, Boston was a leader. They liked being a leader in some of these things, but it did not come to anything until each town, one by one, came to decide on its own that it was in favor of changing from being British citizens to British subjects to American citizens. One of the things, I've timed out. If you could start this, don't mind starting this. Come on, honey. One of the things that I've really enjoyed learning about in the last 15 years that I've been doing research on towns in this area during this period is that every single one was different. There is no typical town. Thank you. Yes. Some of the factors that shaped the differences in the town were, where was the town located? Was it connected to Boston? Was it a seacoast town, a seaport town? Was it an interior town? Was it on post roads, or was it isolated? How old and wealthy was the town? And these two things are linked because it takes time to develop wealth in new land. You have to develop the raw land. You need generations to build estates and wealth. It takes time for men to rise to gentlemen and then to earn appointments as judges and justices of the peace and royal commissions, to be invested in the British government. It also mattered whether there was a presence of merchants and trade networks in the town. These people were most affected by the taxes that were being levied, but they were also most affected by the boycotts that were being proposed in response to those taxes. Surprisingly, it was affected a great deal by the nature of the minister in the town, who ministers held very influential positions. And there were two main types of ministers. There could be ministers who were a member of the Black Regiment, which was the name that the British derisively gave to radical patriotic ministers in Massachusetts who preached essentially revolution. They basically thought that their parishioners had a divine responsibility to protect the sacred inheritance they had been given of land and religious liberty, given for themselves and for their children. And they said that if they did not stand up to protect that, they were committing a great sin of omission for which they would be held responsible. Or you might have a minister on the opposite side of the street who believed firmly that God had established the order, the social order, and the great chain of being. God had established where people stood in the hierarchy of mankind, and that people had no right to challenge that, and particularly no right to challenge their government authorities or their ministerial authorities. So they tended to preach very firm Tory or loyalist views. We still there?
I think so.
And the last thing that was really strong, that always surprised me, was the role of local personalities. And I think this plays true to today. We tend to underestimate it in looking for big thematic changes. But in fact, the power of individuals with charisma and influence to shape the mentality of a town was really strong. So I'll give you two examples. The first is Groton. Groton was a very old town. I think we're down. There we go. Groton was a very old town. It started off as a Native American trading center back in the early 1600s. By 1770s, it was very well established. It had a fair amount of wealth. It had the presence of courts and appointed justices of the peace, people with many ties to crown authorities. It was a center for trade in the hinterland, and it had some powerful merchants, and particularly one family, the Cutler family, and Ebenezer Cutler was a leading man in town. He was imperious, he spoke derisively about any resistance to the crown, and he held powerful sway over town meeting and town affairs. The minister was a very conservative man, a measured man, but he leaned towards being a Tory with respect for order, and the result was that resistance was very, very slow to form in Groton. It did not actually happen until very late, the fall of 1774, when the farmers rose up and essentially confined their minister to his house, barred him from the pulpit, chased the Cutlers out of town, claimed the Cutlers' property. The Cutlers had to flee first to Boston and then to Nova Scotia, and were never allowed to return. And these farmers took over and decided how things would happen very late in the process. This is one example of what could happen. Another example, the exact opposite, is Lexington, a much, much younger town, a mid-sized farming town with average wealth and no stores, no great gentlemen, a true Black Regiment minister, preached fiery sermons early on about religious and civil freedom. And Lexington was one of the most active towns in civil protest from 1765 on. So these are just two examples, but every town I've done has had a different story. I have now close to 20 towns that I've delved deeply into, and they all have unique stories. But it's not till the people in that town are ready to act that change happens. So what about Acton? What's Acton's story? I've been told to wait a second. I'm going to tell you anyway. So Acton in location was a rural farming town. Acton was not the center of anything in the early 1770s. It was a satellite town of Concord. It was also not that old. Although there had been settlers here in the 17th century, the town was not incorporated until 1735. Compare that to Concord, incorporated 1635, or Groton, 1655. So there hadn't been time for local people to develop a great deal of generational wealth and the power that goes with that. Then the economy of Acton, this was almost exclusively a farming town. There are no major rivers that run through Acton. There are some brooks that powered a few smaller mills, but Acton was not, nor was Acton a crossroads. It was not a commercial center. There were no stores. The Jones Tavern supposedly had a store in 1750, but by 1771, the tax assessment valuation for the town revealed that there was no one who held, well, there was one person who held a small amount, but practically no one who held enough property to qualify as running a store, enough trading stock to run a store. That one person was Mark White. So unlike Concord, and also unlike Concord, Acton had no major crafts shops making luxury goods like clocks or furniture. It was basically a stable, growing farm town. And here's something that the nerd in me just loves to delve into. If you look at the Acton valuation, or all the valuations that were taken in 1771, a valuation is when the provincial government asked every town to submit the assessed wealth and the types of assessed wealth of the people, all the people in the town. So if you look at the way they assessed the wealth of a whole farm was to say, how much would this rent for annually? And that is gathered for all the towns who were part of the evaluation, Acton was below average for wealth. The average wealth is 4.62 pounds rental for an year. Acton was 3.72. Littleton was more average, Concord a little above, and towns like Framingham and Marlborough on major trade routes like the Post Road, way up there. So Acton's not, we're connecting again. Oh, I need the slide just after that. Can I tell you about this? Yes, I guess we'll just say that Acton, I'll just leave it at that Acton was of slightly below average wealth. So this is not a town of great men, great gentlemen. It's a town of average farmers, all farmers, yeomen. A yeoman society is a good way to call it. Are we back there? Because I'd love
Changing your.
That was good, what you just had for a second.
It's not going to stay.
So the next thing I want to tell you about wealth is that Acton's wealth was relatively evenly distributed. There were no great squires. There were no wealthy gentlemen. Oh, great. Thank you.
Right there or one more?
One more. There.
Okay, you're good to go.
Okay.
Just, up and this page down, page up.
Okay. Thank you. So the richest man in Acton had an estate worth 16 pounds. In Concord, it was higher. In Sudbury, much higher. In Charlestown, Boston, and Salem, you could see that the richest man had substantially more. This was a modest town. And the bottom third of the men on the valuation had no wealth because they were young men still working for their fathers, waiting to achieve their farms, to be given their farms. And the rest of them all clustered between 3 and 16 pounds, rather tightly together. So this is a town of evenly distributed wealth. Again, yeoman farmers very much on the same level, doing the same work with the same resources altogether. And finally, you know what else I want to mention about that, about the wealth? As we'll come to it, you notice that a lot of the talk in protests will be about reducing the town's superfluities, meaning reducing the luxuries that the town is consuming from abroad, and it's mostly aimed at women, by the way. They think that women are buying too many luxuries from abroad. Acton, frankly, does not have the excess wealth to be consuming a great deal of superfluities. If you're here last year, remember we went through Isaac Davis's inventory when he died and went room by room through his possessions. He was in the top third of wealth for the town, and he had very simple utilitarian possessions, no luxury items at all. And then the last thing about Acton that we'd look at is, no, not the last thing, Acton's minister, John Swift. I would love to know more about John Swift. There are very few reports on him. Unlike almost all the other ministers in the other towns, he did not keep a diary or a journal. And what he did keep, this handwriting is so incredibly poor that it's really hard to decipher. But we learn from his gravestone and from what other people at the time sort of hearsay about him was that he was a plain, practical, serious preacher and a faithful minister. He was not a loyalist. Neither was he a fiery Black Regiment preacher. His biggest claim to fame was being a peacekeeper. So this is not someone who's going to be riling up the town. And then the last thing we looked at was prominent men, the prominent men. The men in green here, oh, it doesn't show up green there. Oh, well. These are the 15 men that were most active in town affairs in the 7 years before the Revolution. They are men of a range of wealth. Yes, there are some men in the top area, 16 pounds, but there are also a fair number of very, very deeply involved men, leaders, who are only in the, have only 6 or 7 pounds. So Acton is not yet to the point of having gentlemen who are so well respected that everyone defers to them. They are still at the stage where most voices are being heard. On the other side, you also see their average age, and this is not surprising. Most of the leaders were middle-aged, not elderly and not young. So you're seeing middle-aged men of, for the most part, a range, but mostly average wealth, being the prominent leaders in town. Again, these are farmers working farming land. By the way, the one person that I found very interesting and hard to understand was Samuel Jones, the tavern keeper. And the reason I found him hard to understand was he was the wealthiest man in town. And he held not a single town office, not even hog reeve, where you chase after the hogs, not a single office throughout any point. And at first I thought, was he loyalist leaning? Because he was a shopkeeper and he was an attorney, and these are both fields where people might tend to want to resist overthrow of government. But he married Isaac Davis's widow. His son served in the Revolution. He went on to live happily in town for the rest of his time. He just simply wasn't chosen by his fellow men as a leader. Perhaps he was not respected for what they cited the most, which was being a man of, I shouldn't defame him since we don't know, but a man of deep thought and deep character. But in any event, there were no prominent men who overwhelmed everyone else by their wealth in Acton. So the sum of Acton's nature, it's not a hotbed of revolutionary fervor. It has no radical minister. It has no Tory gentleman. It's a town of relatively equals farmers who we'll find out are mostly concerned with local issues. And this delays them for quite a while in addressing imperial issues because they had not been involved with imperial issues. In fact, every town was allowed to elect a representative to the provincial Congress. Acton didn't for the first 40 years. Why? It cost money to send a man to the Congress, and they didn't think that what the Congress was doing had much to do with what they were concerned about, which was their land, their schools, their roads, paying their tax bills. So they didn't even bother for that period of the time before then. So, given all this, the second part of this program, how did Acton respond? And I was going to move really quickly through the early parts of this because we talked about the various revolutionary, various things that incited anger last year, the period from the 10 years between 1765 and 1775. But since some of you have just gotten to the French and Indian War, I will mention them each as we go through. So let's look at what happened and how Acton responded to it. Start with the Stamp Act. If you remember John Adams, well, you won't remember because you haven't been there yet, but when the Stamp Act was passed, there was a great deal of resistance. John Adams wrote something called the Braintree Resolves, and many towns wrote similar things or supported the Braintree Resolves. Acton was silent. There was nothing from Acton about the Stamp Act. 2 years later, the Townshend Acts. The Townshend Acts, in June of 1767, Parliament levied duties on many imported items. These are the superfluities that we talked about earlier. They're trying to raise money by taxing things that the Americans buy from British exporters. Boston signed a covenant to boycott all taxed items and to avoid purchasing these superfluities and to encourage local manufacturers to produce locally instead of importing things. And Boston sends letters to each of the towns asking them to weigh in on this and to respond with strong rhetoric and resolve. January 1768, for the first time, Acton responds. Not overwhelmingly, but they have a town meeting to consider whether the town, quote, will comply with the proposal sent to this town by the town of Boston relating to the encouraging of manufacturers among ourselves and not purchasing of superfluities from abroad. We voted in the affirmative. Period. Stop. That was all they commented. And this may seem tepid, but remember, this is the first time they have responded and engaged in provincial matters. So is that a leg out from the stool? Maybe? I don't know. You get to decide. In February of that year, Samuel Adams, always a troublemaker, wrote a letter to all the towns, called a circular letter, detailing the grievances over the Townshend Acts and promoting boycotts. And the Mass legislature approved that letter, and the letter is circulated to all the towns and asks the towns for support. Acton's response, this I found wonderful. For the first time, town meeting sits up and says, I think we need to have a representative in this Congress. We better pay for one. And they elect Captain Daniel Fletcher. For the first time ever, they send a representative to Congress, and he is sitting in this Congress. Maybe a leg, I don't know. Well, what happens to that Congress is that the governor is furious over the circular letter and the boycott, and he demands that the Congress vote to rescind the boycott, or he says he will shut down the legislature. 17 members of the legislature agree and vote to rescind. 92 refuse, and they become the glorious 92, heroes throughout the entire colony. This is a Paul Revere bowl that's engraved with the glorious 92. And if you have any questions about where Captain Daniel Fletcher came in, I came across a newspaper. If you look second from the bottom, these are the honest 92 members who voted not to rescind. Acton, Captain Daniel Fletcher. So Acton did come in on the dangerous side. Fall of that year, things are heating up. British troops arrive in Boston. The people of Massachusetts are shocked over the occupation of Boston and of the closing of the legislature. And so the people of Boston ignored the ban on assemblies, and they called on all the towns to elect representatives to their own convention. So this is a bold, illegal assembly. How did Acton respond? Did it send someone to this illegal assembly? Of the 200 towns, 100 sent someone. Acton Town Meeting, September 20th, 1768. Captain Daniel Fletcher, chosen as our delegate to the Boston Assembly. They did send someone. Another leg? The delegates met in October of 1768. They drafted a petition to the king. The king ignored it, and on they went. 1769, Boston urges, Boston's always making trouble, isn't it? Boston urges complete boycott of all imported goods from January of 69 to January of 70. And with no imported fabric, spinning your own yarn and making your own homespun became a patriotic act that women could do. And many towns, like Lexington, hosted these patriotic spinning bees and then clothed their minister in homespun suits. Acton did not. I guess the ladies of Acton weren't. Oh, well, we won't defile them. 1773, we're getting closer. It's getting hotter. Parliament stirs things up again. It passes a number of laws that mean that the government of Massachusetts and of the governor of Massachusetts and of judges were now going to be paid by the crown, not the towns, and the governor was going to be given new powers, essentially taking the powers out of the hands of the people and giving them to Crown authorities. So Samuel Adams, again, writes the Boston pamphlet on how colonist rights had been violated. It actually is, if you can handle the 18th century rhetoric, it's fascinating to hear them list the rights that they believed they had that were being violated and how they were being violated. Then they send this pamphlet out to all the towns. They ask the towns, please respond. Please respond to this. Tell us if you agree. January 18th, 1773, Acton, one of the first towns to respond. And I'm going to read you an excerpt from their response. Hang with the language. I think it's pretty interesting for these farmers who weren't interested in anything but being allowed to keep farming. They say, taking into serious consideration the alarming circumstances of this province relating to the violations of our charter rights and privileges by the British administration, we are of the opinion that the rights of the colonists are well stated by the town of Boston, and it is also our opinion that the taxing of us without our consent, the making of governors of the province and judges of the superior court independent of the people and dependent on the crown only, by having their salary paid by the crown out of the money extorted from us, and many other instances of encroachments upon our said charter rights are intolerable grievances and have a direct tendency to overthrow our happy constitution and bring us into a state of abject slavery. Those are the yeoman farmers of Acton speaking in January of 1773. I like to think that's a leg out of the stool. Well, finally, we come to that fateful year of 1774, 250 years ago. As you heard at the beginning of the talk, the Boston Tea Party in December of 1773, they knew that there would be a response, and they had to wait for it. They had to wait for the news to go from there back to England, for decisions to be made, and then for the repercussions to come from England back to them. They finally arrived May 10th of 1774, and they were pretty intolerable, as the historians came to call it, these intolerable acts. They were going to close the port of Boston until they were repaid for the damage to the tea. They were going to ban town meetings except for once a year to transact basic town business. They were going to make the appointments and pay of judges by the Crown. Jury selection, which used to be done in each town, was going to be made by the Crown. The locations of trials was going to be taken from the towns in which the offense was committed and sent overseas for certain officials. All of these have been referred to as the coercive or intolerable acts. I have to tell you that the response throughout the countryside was of overwhelming alarm. For the first time, even rural and distant towns, even the towns out in Berkshire, stood up and took notice in horror for anyone to tell them that they couldn't hold town meetings, that they couldn't elect their own judges, that they couldn't decide who was going to try the people who had accused of crimes, and there was terrifying to these people. These were their most sacred rights of self-government they had been so proud of, and they were now being taken away. In the countryside, for the first time, they felt directly affected by imperial policy. So here the story of Acton gets particularly interesting. Boston sent a letter to protest all of this, but then also to call on all of the towns across the province to join in a solemn league and covenant which was a total boycott on importing, selling, purchasing, or consuming any goods from Britain. And those who didn't conform to this were to be shunned, and their names were to be published as an enemy to the people and to the country. Boston sent this solemn league and covenant to all the towns with a blank space, as you can see at the bottom, for all the men of that town to sign their names to the covenant, and for it to be reported who refused to sign, if any, and then a blank spot for the date, June blank 1774. What does Acton do about this solemn league and covenant? I have to tell you first, the governor was furious about this, and he said anyone who signed this would be prosecuted. Now that puts the townspeople in a sticky place. It particularly puts the town clerk in a sticky place because he has to record what the town had decided. So every town in Massachusetts received a copy. Here's Westford's copy. You can see they all signed underneath. Acton is silent. There's no record of a response. But I do believe the story is much more interesting than that. I think there's a very good chance that Acton was not silent. It's very unfortunate that Reverend John Swift did not keep a journal, because we find out from many ministers' journals that the towns were signing this document, and the town clerk was not recording it. He was leaving a blank space to protect him and the other members of the town. And I do believe that's what happened in Acton. One of the reasons I believe that that was what happened in Acton was that, let's not jump there. One of the reasons that I believe that's what happened in Acton is the town clerk records no business happened in Acton from May until the end of September of 1774. And we know that's not true. We know from other sources that the town met and did various forms of rebellious activity, including electing officials to places they shouldn't have been going by law, but none of it shows up in the town records. So, best example of that, at the end of the summer, you know, that the law had said it was illegal for the towns to meet, but nobody had said it was illegal for the counties to meet. So the counties started having conventions where they would draw together, have delegates come from each of the towns, and they would make resolutions. We know that Acton met, that summer because the Middlesex Convention held August 30th to 31st had, according to a newspaper, not according to any record recorded by the town clerk, but according to a newspaper, had the same familiar representatives, Francis Faulkner, John Haywood, Ephraim Hapgood. At that meeting, the Middlesex resolves that they put out were radical. And I think you'd have to say, since Acton agreed to these, this has got to be another leg out of that stool. Take this one brief excerpt. It is evident to every attentive mind that this province is in a very dangerous and alarming situation. We are obliged to say, however painful it may be to us, that the question now is whether, by a submission to some late acts of Parliament of Great Britain, we are contented to be the most abject slaves and entail that slavery on posterity after us, or by a manly, joint, and virtuous opposition, assert and support our freedom. I'd like to think that's a leg on this stool. And so finally we come to Crown Resistance Day. What happens is that the whole province of Massachusetts decides to hold an illegal, an extra-legal, well, it was just plain illegal, convention in Concord. And they ask every town to send representatives. On October 3rd, Crown Resistance Day, Acton holds an illegal, prohibited town meeting, and it's openly recorded by the town clerk. Acton votes to send 2 delegates to this illegal provincial congress, and it also votes to form a committee of correspondence and to appoint men who accept that call. Acton's actions are openly treasonous, and they no longer try to hide it. They record it publicly. And I do think this is a stirring moment to remember. Certainly a good argument for the last leg of that table. They had decided. That first provincial Congress recommends extremely radical procedures, that every town raise, train, equip, and pay militia. Acton did. That they each town withhold the provincial tax payment that they should have paid to the crown government and pay it instead to the rebel government. Acton did withhold the tax payment, but they didn't pay it to the rebel government. They just said, well, we just think we'll hold on to it for a while. So Acton kept it here, but they went halfway on that. And then that the towns join a continental association, which essentially is all of the colonies agreeing to a boycott against goods. The interesting part of that is they also asked them to compel people who would not sign it to do so or to be listed as enemies of the people. And this means turning to you people, your fellow townsmen, and either ostracizing them, shunning them, or worse, and worse was done in some towns. Harassment of Tories happened all over. It did not happen that I can find, I know it would be a fun story, but I did not find any harassment of Tories in Acton. And I think that's because there weren't that many proclaimed Tories in Acton. I think that Acton, it had always been a yeoman's farming town. It became alarmed when they thought that its basic rights were being taken away from them, and that most people sided, if not enthusiastically, sided with the Patriots in the need to do this, to do what they were doing. There was an Acton man involved in harassing Tories, however. Concord had a lot of Tories, and Robert Chafin, I think his name is, from Acton, was put in charge of meting out harassment to Tories. The Tories were brought together in Acton, in Concord Center, and they were asked to sign loyalty oaths or to deny whatever previous things they'd done that were upsetting. Those that refused were given what were common forms of crowd or mob action at the time, which was basically to humiliate the person. Riding someone on a rail, I don't know if you've ever heard that phrase, to be ridden on a rail. Do you know what it means? It means that they actually take a rail and they put a man on it and they bounce it around town for as long as they want to. That was one form of humiliation. There were many forms, and apparently Robert Chafin was very good at meting them out. He was put in charge of this, so he did do that. Finally, although Crown Resistance Day is a good day to celebrate, I think there's an even better one, and I hope Acton adds it to its celebrations. It comes a bit later. It happens in May of 1776. The Continental Congress is considering whether or not to declare independence. And they are a little scared about this. And they decide to send all their representatives home to have their legislatures vote on whether or not they want to declare independence. John Adams comes home and he says, no, we don't need representatives to vote on this. We need the townsmen. We want every single town to have a town meeting and every single eligible voter in that town to vote whether or not they want to declare independence, which I think is incredibly cool. So in June 14th of 1776, Acton had this town meeting. And I'm going to read you as an ending what Acton said. The subverting of our Constitution The many injuries and unheard of barbarities which these colonies have received from Great Britain confirms us in the opinion that the present age will be deficient in their duty to God, their posterity, and themselves if they do not establish an independent American republic. This is the only form of government we wish to see established, and we give our strongest assurance that if they should declare America to be a free and independent republic, we will support and defend the measure with our lives and our fortunes. That is an Acton Declaration of Independence, and I think it's really cool. If we can add June 14th into the register, it would be great. But till then, we can remember October 3rd as the date that Acton decided to come out in public as being in favor of rebellion. Thanks.
Don't run away yet.
Okay.
Thank you, thank you.
And a special thanks to all my technical helpers.
For me personally, I appreciate so much how Mary has presented this, because I've tried to read what is accessible to me, and I could not make it coherent. And particularly for the sophomores who are here, who are going to spend a great deal of this year reading primary sources, chosen for you, and understandably so. What you've heard here is something so much deeper, so much more sophisticated, in the sense of having to create the context. And so if we don't have the documents here, darn, to look at Westford or other towns in order to understand the puzzle, because we have missing pieces.
We do.
Correct? And so this is really the role, emerging role of what is called a public historian, to go deeper and deeper into a local history. Thank you again.
Prior events to being sharply for, or at least against the crown, and for and what that entails. What happened there in 1773 that took it such a turn?
There were many things that were happening in 1773, but one of the things I would point out about Acton's responses in 1773, I didn't put it in the excerpts. Even in 1773, although they were very angry at Parliament, they were still saying at the end of their protests, however, we have a good and gracious king whom we are sure will come to our rescue us and will make things right. A petition was sent to the king, and he did reject it. When was that? I think that was in 1773. You probably, I don't have the quote with me anymore. There is a wonderful quote by John Adams that says, essentially, the die is cast. There is no turning back. We can only go forward in revolution now, essentially. That's paraphrasing. And that, he said, in 1773. So there was this growing sense that this situation, that the people that they were petitioning to and appealing to and putting their hopes in were not responding and were not going to. And then after the Tea Party, they knew something bad was coming. And when they heard what was coming in 1774, that is why the book that you mentioned is called The Long Year of 1774. That is the year that everything came together for those who were,
Yep, here it is.
Yes.
This is the book. Yep. Mary Beth Norton.
Any other questions?
Yep. Over here.
Yes.
I just thought for a moment if we could consider the Native American Indians that lived here and the perspective from their side.
Could I try answering that just a little bit?
Sure.
On December 5th, we're going to, in this very room, we're going to have a speaker on that subject.
Great.
how it affected, the world was in turmoil for the Native Americans before this revolution, but this also added another kind of whole spin to the whole thing. So there will be a talk by Professor
And I'm
Daniel Mandel.
grateful because it's a really complicated question, and I don't feel that I'm qualified to answer it right now, but I am grateful. Do come and hear what they say about it. The Native American situation throughout the Revolution was, well, and through the prior French and Indian War and in the period after that, very complicated and very sad.
Thanks.
Yeah.
There was somebody over here, wasn't there? One of you got, come on. Students? Oh, sorry. Did Bill have his hand? I did. Bill, it's coming to you.
When you were looking at this, the Historical Society has all of Professor Phelan's paperwork, which the family has given us. It's in many boxes, so there may be fragments of something that you were trying to find that we do have.
I urge any of you who want to do any local history research to make use of the Historical Society. I can't tell you how exciting and helpful it was very early on to find that the transcribed notes of all of the town meeting records were available online, searchable, through the Acton Historical Society. And Mr. Phelan was a really fine historian, and his papers would be invaluable too. There's so much there that go. Just go. It's wonderful. Yes?
That ties to my question. We're reading Braintree Instructions on Monday, and then we'll read Tom Paine and John Dickinson. Do you have a favorite primary source that is a must-read to understand kind of the changing attitudes?
Well, that's not really fair, because my primary sources that I love the most are the ones that provide the words of everyday people in towns around. So they're not going to be the sorts of primary sources that are usually published in books or excerpted online. Those primary sources where I come across the real words of people from the town of Acton or Groton or Lexington or Bolton. Boy, Bolton was boy, what a story there. Try Littleton. Littleton, oh, they shot through the minister's front door and they I mean, it's wonderful, wonderful stories. And people's comments on it in town meeting records to come across those words. If you can be patient with the way people spoke and wrote in the 18th century, to touch those, the words, to recover the words that people spoke in your town at that time, I just think is really fascinating. So that's my cheating answer. I love the local primary sources, which is why I'm a public historian.
Any other questions?
I have a comment.
Here we are.
What? Where are we? Okay. Over here?
I don't have a question, I just have a comment. And this is like to the kids too. The way you put this together was so personal, and it made me feel so proud, and it really made it real and authentic. And I think that it's a really awesome place to live, where it was such an important part of our history.
I would just say about that, when we are in school and we're learning a long list of acts, the Townsend Acts, the Tea Act, the Sugar Act, but those were real acts that had real effects on people's lives, and people responded to them, and to see them in that context rather than just a long list of imperial declarations, I think is so much more interesting. So, yeah.
Oh, why was Acton so nonchalant about the English oppression?
I don't think it was nonchalant. I think Acton was busy farming.
Okay.
And town meeting records throughout most of the 1760s are electing town officers, deciding where the schools would be and who was going to be the school teacher and how much they were going to be paid, and who was going to do the work on the roads, and who was going to take care of pigs that got out of someone's farm. And that was the stuff of their daily lives, and they needed to come to see that they needed to come to the point of feeling that these imperial matters were going to affect their lives and going to be important to them. And once they did, I think then they were all for protecting what mattered to them, which was their self-government within their town.
Okay, thank you.
Bill, you had
Yeah, I was going to make a couple of comments.
Yep.
I do not know what Reverend Swiss, the condition of his health was. I do believe that he passed.
He died, yeah.
Yeah, he died, I believe, November of 1775.
And he was said to bless the men as they marched off that morning.
Yep.
But yes, he was ill, which may have had some effect on the degree to which he was.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I've read some of his sermons from that period of time, and you can see a big decline from other stuff that was going on in town here. And I just wanted to make known the fact that Robert Chaffin's house still stands on Newtown Road, and most of the other houses that you talk about are still standing, particularly the house at 108 Strawberry Hill Road, which did belong to Mark White. His tavern is standing. Unfortunately, is now in the town of Newbury, up in the North Shore. We have stray cattle, we have stray houses. Thank you.
Reading ministers' sermons may be considered thankless, but oh boy, there's so much in there. There's so much to learn about the way people thought at that time.
Hi, I was just wondering what was Boxborough's role in anything? Because I mean, it's just like a next door town, and I know that they're probably like a yeoman community as well, because of farming.
So Boxborough was still part of Acton at the time. In fact, the Pfeiffer on April 19th lived in Boxborough. So. Pardon? Now, what is now Boxborough was not Boxborough. Luther Blanchard, the Pfeiffer, one of the first to die. So Acton Boxborough was included in all of this because it still was part of Acton at the time. Yeah. Boxborough, I have to say this because I lived in Boxborough for 20 plus years. Boxborough has some great primary sources from when they become their town of their own. Anyone else? Yes?
How come Salem was richer than Boston?
Salem was, Salem was a fishing port and a trading port, and if you want to see the finest colonial furniture, go up to the Peabody Essex and look at what was being made in Salem at the time, because there was money in Salem. More money, apparently, than there was in Boston. Yeah. Salem, that's a fascinating story. That's a great place to explore.
Thanks.
Anyone else? I just want to thank you all for your attention and your patience with our... Oh, yes.
Referring back to a previous question, why did Boxborough break off from Acton? Well,
let's just say they didn't want to go that far to church. But this issue of towns breaking off from other towns was something that was constant throughout the 18th and 19th century. It's all over the place. When the town gets large enough that they feel that they can support a church on their own, and it's expensive to support a church. You have to pay the minister's salary, you have to pay for the building of the church building and the maintenance of it. But when they feel they can afford to do that, many towns try to. Carlisle tried repeatedly and got rebuffed by Concord. Acton, I think, had a pretty easy time breaking off from Concord, didn't it? Didn't Acton, they only had to ask once?
Well, Concord, where we are right now was Concord
Yes.
until 1735.
35.
As far as Foxborough is concerned, it was never Acton. It was Stowe.
Stowe.
Acton, and Littleton.
You are right, you are right, you are absolutely right. But the little part that Luther Blanchard came from,
It's Littleton.
oh, there you go. So Jeffrey, you are Littleton.
That's why they're buried in Littleton.
The Littleton, they're buried in Littleton. Okay, but the dividing up of towns was very often very contested because the original towns didn't want to lose the tax revenue and the big arguments. But yeah, dividing up towns and starting new ones was common.
For the record, 1868, Boxborough wanted to join with West Acton and make it its own town because it had a railroad.
A railroad, yep. Railroad changes everything. That's a whole new part of history. I just want to thank you all for your attention and your patience with the technical issues. I am always astonished when other people are as interested in what happened locally as I am, and that's very gratifying to me. So I thank you. I thank you all.